really struck by not only your sort of breadth of knowledge about help and support content in general, but also how you view it as a distinct discipline, like it is its own thing. And for many individuals and companies, they tend to view it as an afterthought or something that sort of like has to be done, like a checkbox to sort of tick on the way to releasing a product. But you have this really, I think, comprehensive and mature understanding about support content, about how it's not only a cost, it's an asset for a business. And it's been really interesting getting to know, you and your thoughts on that. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you got to where you are now and what you're doing, and a little bit of an introduction of yourself to the listeners.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I care a lot about customer support and the support content that goes alongside it. We were talking about how I'm from the South, and I think that comes from, so my family has a small clothing store in Southern Alabama, and that business largely exists and survives on relationships. And with the support that you provide people can find the exact same clothes in my family store that they can find at Nordstrom or at Dillard's or whatever it is. But small businesses like that, when you grow up in that environment, you start to understand, like, people come in for the clothes, sure, but they also come in for the guidance, for the help, for knowing that someone's going to take care of them. But yeah, so coming from that background, and I graduated from school, I did write, like, the communications degree is the degree without choosing a degree sometimes. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I loved writing, and I wanted to find something more stable. I was living in Chicago and found a role through customer support. I realized that was my in to getting into the tech industries. I knew there was a lot of potential there. And yeah, at a small, medium company, Envoy Global, learned a lot about immigration as well as tech. And pretty quickly started to see some trends in the ways that we could communicate with customers to give them a better experience with our platform, with what they were going through. And I started to get more involved with the product teams working with content in the platform. So I was kind of doing a little bit of content design without fully realizing what that was. But really kept working on and seeing the impacts that we could make from the support team when it came to advocating for content for our users, because ultimately, like, the design is obviously very important, but the number of tickets we would get because someone was confused about help text or about the way that a question was phrased. I mean, immigration is complicated in its own right. When you put it into a platform in a way that people haven't seen it before, it's a great thing, but it's, even more complicated. So, yeah, seeing that proactive communication was a big thing, as well as having resources to help the team with getting through tickets more quickly, helping with onboarding. Just kind of found my passion there. And yeah, once I left Envoy, I had the opportunity to start working with, so I was also our Zendesk admin, had a great relationship with Corey LaPlante at LaPlante Management. That's who I've been working with, subcontracting on some Zendesk Guide projects with him and his team, and had to kind of figure out a lot of this stuff on my own. Every project I learned a little bit as I went along. I was constantly looking for resources to help me figure things out.
I think one of the things that really is fascinating about help and support content is that, well, number one, it is similar and yet different to existing practices. So, for example, technical documentation you mentioned. And so understanding the difference between those two things, because they are different and they have their distinct disciplines. There's also a lot of overlap with content design. So things like information architecture, structuring things correctly, as you mentioned, style and so on. They're so critical to a good help and support feature, asset, whatever you want to call it. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what you think the current state of help centers and support is overall, because obviously, the industry has moved for a long time to self-serve support. And I guess I don't think that there's a real defining discipline or best practices for a lot of help center content. And I feel like you've had to really discover that on your own. So if you look at the landscape today of all the different various companies out there, all their help centers and all their support documentation, um, what do you see as some of the biggest problems the industry is facing?
Well, I think firstly, you just said it. The lack of consistency is huge. You go to the help center of one organization and you have an okay experience. You go to another and you have a great experience. You go to another and it's, what are you looking at?
Hmm.
Why is this
Yep.
here? This is creating more problems than when I started. I remember when I first started, really like when I kind of realized that, okay, support help center content is going to be my niche and this is what I am doing. And I started digging around and it was baffling to me that I think that like a help center, right? We consider that the primary deliverable of support content. When you look at help centers across the board, there is absolutely no consistency or process or easily discoverable and followable way of approaching that kind of
Hmm.
content. And it doesn't seem like any organizations are really, I think people within organizations are trying. There's certainly practices that stand out. I learned a lot about KCS, and I think it has a lot of merits to it. But not so much. I think what I found too is that you really can't approach every single support content experience the same way because it is always going to depend on your user base, the industry
Yeah.
that you're in, the complexity of the product. So it is really hard in general to find ways to standardize that.
Hmm.
I do think it's possible the more that we see an emphasis on structured content, when you see it's mostly a technical writing practice, but of like DITA and Markdown, that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
when people are really taking it to the far lengths, like at that enterprise level, it is possible because they build out some really complex and great help center experiences in that way. I think that something that stands out that has been in my experience and a lot of other people who kind of not necessarily struggle with support content, but people who work in this space and kind of are looking for like what do we do? What's the best thing here? It's in that kind of growing small, mid-sized, smaller enterprise organizational space where there's not really a need for something as robust as data and technical writing and really building out that structured content. It's just not worth the investment.
Yep.
It's valuable, and you can certainly set yourself up for success for that in the future. But most organizations don't want or need to invest in such a robust process, or such a robust content practice, I guess. It's a complicated line that's really difficult to articulate.
Yeah.
But basically, I think the difference is there's organizations with large investments in their content already, or there's a really obvious payoff to investing in the support content. I think you see it a lot with super technical organizations where you have that, technical writing, you have that really heavy developer focus, those skilled professionals who are consuming your content. But for those of us that are working in those B2C spaces or the less technical B2B, which usually seems to occur at like a smaller sized organization, mid-level, yeah, we don't we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to not even the bandwidth, the access to getting some of those more advanced content practices going. It's usually, I mean, literally the way that you could say I officially got into this was developing Envoy's FAQ pages. And I remember working on some kind of they were launching a 4.0 version of the platform. And I was working with one of the UX designers, and we had this Word doc, we reworked everything, and then it just kind of didn't go anywhere. And then like 2 years later, the COO and my director were kind of like, all right, we need self-serve support. This is a thing now. We're doing self-serve support and support. You're going to do that and figure it out. And I was, for better or worse, in the position of like, we actually have a document where we have started on this process of reorganizing and and reworking all of these user-facing resources, because my team was getting feedback all the time. Like if a user found the FAQs, they were horrible. They were so outdated. I think they were about the 2.0 version of our platform, and we had already at that point launched the 4.0 version, and it was not good. And it's a story that I think a lot of individuals working with this content can relate to, where you kind of have this project thrust on your plate and you don't really know where to go from there.
Hmm.
Leadership is like, we need self-serve, we need a help center, we need support content, whatever you want to call it. And then you're in that position of, okay, now what? What
Yeah.
do I do now? On a similar but different vein, the work that I've been doing, subcontracting with LaPlante, has been orgs that are buying into the Zendesk suite. So when they buy Zendesk, they are usually purchasing it for the ticketing system. You have, better way to agents, live chat tools, they have call tool, all that. It's the whole one and done suite. That's most ticketing systems, whether that's Zendesk, Salesforce, Intercom, you name it. Help Scout's another one. And now they have access to a platform. So when I was working at Envoy, we were publishing those FAQs through WordPress and through the marketing team's website, what we called hidden links, where it wasn't discoverable, but that was where we had the option to publish it. And some people, they get the opportunity through the Zendesk Guide. It's one of the products within that suite, and they want to make use of it because it's not that hard to make the argument that having content about your product or service is helpful to people.
Yeah.
I think all of us can relate to something happens or you don't know what to do, you're going to Google it.
Yep.
From an organizational perspective, I'd rather users find that content from me at the organization than from a Reddit thread that may or may not be accurate or kindly on it.
And that's an interesting thing. I am really struck by, just in my own personal experience with help and support, because I have had to deal with so many help and support experiences from, our site has, so many different technical aspects to it that at one point or another, I've had to contact support. And when it comes, then the difference between those organizations that treat it as problems to solve is clear versus those that treat their support content as an asset. And those that treat their support content as an asset, I am consistently more willing to spend money with them, to come back to them, to buy more of their products, because they have not only sort of anticipated my likely problems, but if there isn't something or an answer available, they're sort of quick to really help me out. And then my experience ends up informing what content they create. So next time I go, I'm like, oh, there's an article based on like the problem I had, And so I'm just wondering, like, in your conversations with your clients, different organizations, what has your approach been in terms of convincing them to treat support this way, as opposed to just, this is just some checkboxes. Let's throw up a couple of FAQs. How do you get them to think, oh, this is actually an asset that we need to sort of nurture and build as a practice?
So a lot of times it can help to look at support content as kind of the supplement to the overall journey of the user, right? A lot of us, by instinct, we think about support content and help center content as where you go to solve problems, which is true to a degree. But sometimes thinking of it as a more robust asset that can not only train your users, but also even your support agents and other people. I mean, I've talked to, one of the cool things of this project, we've talked to a lot of people who do this work at a lot of different places. And a lot of folks will get feedback where like their CTO forgot how XYZ feature worked because they're not in the weeds anymore of the trenches. So they look at the help center for guidance. So it's even used as a great internal asset. There was a Salesforce did a series. It's been a minute since I looked at it. I can't remember if it's their content team or their support team, but they did a YouTube series, and one of the people on that team had gone around and done a survey with the sales team and found that the sales team was referring prospects to support content for those more technical. So like the products that you're talking about that are much more technical in nature, where you really need to understand stuff, a salesperson should know a lot about the product. They don't need to know that much. They shouldn't. Their job is to sell the thing and to help you work through the contracts. Their job is not to have an infinite technical understanding of what their product does. That's for the documentation team or the product team. So you can think of it as an asset that way, where when you have a robust support content ecosystem, other teams can benefit from it. That's one way of looking at it. What I've talked more with clients, though, is you kind of think of it as a proactive resource. So working with EV charging and understanding that those the individuals who drive EVs, it's a very interesting population I never thought about. So I thought about EV drivers as like kind of technical people who, I don't know, people in my generation. I have some friends who drive Teslas or other EVs because they care about the
Yeah.
environment. And millennials,
Young
they don't.
and tech, maybe knowledgeable about
Right.
technology and trends and all that
Yeah.
sort of stuff. Yep.
And the people have the income. I remember it kind of struck me where the more feedback I got from one client, they were like, we have a lot of older people who have retired.
Mm.
They have the money for a new vehicle, and they want to do better by the environment because they know it's the right thing to do. And so they go and get their EV. And
Mm.
these salesmen on the car lots hand them the keys and don't give them any other context about how specifically EV
Right.
charging is like filling up your car with gas. It's much different. There's a lot more to know with context there. And that was kind of an eye-opening thing for me because, you mentioned like you go to a help center to solve problems or answer questions, but sometimes users just want to better understand something. They don't necessarily have, I mean, that's product discovery. This is where there can be some crossover with content marketing, where your user base just doesn't fully understand what it is they're working with or why. I mean, how many of us in B2B spaces are working with software that we had no choice but to work with? We inherited
Yeah.
it and we have to figure it out one way or another. Um, and so, yes, we can look at it as a solution for problems and for reducing tickets that way. But sometimes, so this is where I like to talk to orgs about like you can, if you have a really solid support content foundation, you can use that as a jumping point for a lot of different things, whether that's from onboarding. Onboarding flows are great. Sometimes, though, if I know I need to just start using something, I don't have time to go through an entire onboarding process. I'm just going to click through the flow.
Yep.
Helpful, maybe I can find it later, but then I realized later, oh, I needed to find this other thing. That onboarding flow is no longer available to me, or I don't know how to find it. I can go to their help center and find some kind of get started guide that'll kind of give me some more direction later on when I'm looking for that. A big one, and maybe this is because of my background and what I care about, but it definitely speaks to leaders too. If you can have them think of themselves as a consumer and you want to learn more about a product or a company, looking at the help center can say a lot, just pulling up a help center and seeing like, does it look nice? Does it match the branding, or is it a
Right.
mess? Is it a long list of things that overwhelms me? Like that tells me a lot about how the organization is probably going to treat me as a user.
Yep.
This is, again, it's kind of support content really pulls from so many different content practices because that's something where you want to think about it alongside your marketing team, if not from a style guide, then working with marketing directly. Is this mirroring what we're selling to users so that they're having a consistent experience across the board, whether they encounter our content as a prospect, whether they encounter that as a long-term user. I know that there's certain assets, right? Like content marketing with the EV charging, we focus the support content on the specific EV charging network, and then their marketing copy. There's a lot of information about just they have a whole EV 101 course that's been great. I don't want to repeat that in the support content, but I certainly want to complement it because because the people coming to the help center might not be considered prospects anymore doesn't mean that they can't benefit from that content. So there is a benefit to having that relationship with it.
I think one of the things that has really struck me in what you've said is you mentioned the crossover between marketing and support content, and I think for content designers that crossover is really interesting because I know in my own work in content design, I've had experience where I've been working with people who are writing support articles and making sure that what I'm writing is complementing what they're writing and vice versa, right? And I think for a lot of content designers who are listening to this, they have a varied experience with support content. So for some, they might be writing it. And so then they are sort of owning the feature end to end, and they are writing the user interface text, and they're writing the help and support content, and they might even be writing some of the marketing material as well. So in some ways, that's easier because they're controlling the entire experience. For others, they are working in an organization where support is a separate discipline. and they're writing the user interface text. I'm wondering your thoughts on how these two disciplines can work together, because there's obviously a symbiotic relationship, right? The people who are writing the user interface text know that they are trying to preemptively solve problems, and so trying to avoid people going to support content in the first place. But for people who are in support, they can often have their ear to the ground, and so they're hearing that, okay, there's some confusion here about this. Can we go and fix this in the UI so that we're no longer having to, create this content or have this as a, as an option for them to read? I'm wondering your thoughts on like how these two disciplines can work together and really benefit each other.
Matt Patterson from Help Scout, they have some really great resources because he has a support management background and runs a lot of their marketing content. And he did a talk for Write the Docs a while ago, but it was something I saw where he had shown how 3 different support teams work hand in hand with their technical documentation teams to help make sure that their support content is updated, is getting data around it to make sure that it's useful, and finding ways to get feedback, because the larger your organization or the more complex your product offerings, because sometimes you're working with multiple products, it's really hard to maintain a lot of that content. So I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of maintenance for content teams and support teams to work together, because like you said, support teams have their ear to the ground. They are the closest. I've always, they're in the trenches. They're the ones on the front lines talking to customers every day, because your users are the ones coming across some weird bug or something. I would be like, no one releases a bug on purpose, right? Like it's something happened because it happens. A user finds it, you handle it. Like that's so similar to a bug in your product. Your users are going to discover different discrepancies, or maybe they're just confused by certain content, and the support team can help weigh in on that, or even contribute to your content depending on what level you want. So that's the thing too, is like some organizations have support members who are trained on and kind of like mini certified to publish content that is user facing, or just to publish content that's internal facing. That's a really big part of this too. And the conversation about knowledge management versus support content, and like what's the difference. And I think they complement each other really nicely when they're approached intentionally. Sometimes though, it's just a matter, I set up a process for my team and one of my clients where internal users could submit a ticket explicitly about content that needed to be edited or whatever that was. And agents could also flag within tickets. And we had a workflow within there because their support team also managed the support content. So we just worked it right into their workflow. And we had a specific queue of tickets to address things that needed to be edited on the help center, or if something needed to be created. So that's one thing to consider. I think that support agents are also really great resources for testing the effectiveness of content. I firmly believe that any content should have a second set of eyes no matter what, right? Like I know when I write stuff, it makes sense to me in my head, but all of us think a little bit differently. So it's always good to run any piece of content past someone else. It doesn't mean you need to wait on publishing it. Maybe go ahead, write your article if you need to, get it published, but immediately send that to, maybe you have a point of contact on support who can just glance over it. Because the fact is, like, not only does the support team have the most contact with your users, they also are the most exposed to how your users think and how your users absorb the content that they're reading or accessing. I know
I'm
as a
thinking
support
if you're writing
agent,
user interface content, then you should be talking to your support
yes,
team, and if you're
please.
wanting to test content,
The support
send it
team
to
would
them.
be thrilled. Let me tell you, the number of projects after the fact where it would get launched and my team would go through the release notes and be like, oh, okay, that is almost a fix to this problem, but I can think of these 4 specific users who are going to ask us these completely different questions about this.
Yeah, yeah.
Please, 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 in general, talk to your support team because they love it. Obviously, that needs to start with the management of the team. I know that support team, this is where I get excited because I'm like, I know that support teams can feel a little bit difficult to access, right? Like, I know at our org, and I've seen it other places, like there are never enough people to solve the tickets. There are always tickets in the queue. There's always something to do.
Yep.
There's always someone calling. It can be really hard it can feel like you're taking them away from their work. But I promise you that, at least in my experience and every support leader I've talked to, they're very well organized machines when it comes to scheduling people and having off time most of the time. I know when I was managing a team, like the queue is it's necessary. It is very much part of the job, but it is a grind.
Mm,
And any opportunity to kind of get away from the queue is always good. To add to, like, I think support in general is a great starting point for anyone looking to get into tech because it exposes you to every part of the organization. I've got a user with an issue with the product, a user with there was a miscommunication in the sales process. Now I've got to talk to finance. Oh, this marketing copy, whatever it is, you're accessing everyone in the organization, at least, especially as you rise up the ranks. And most support leaders understand that their teams are made up of younger, ambitious individuals who that's a thing. So I've been a part of the support driven community, which anyone doing this kind of work or interested in this kind of work, it's a wonderful community for customer support and support being its own career path. Because I think a lot of people do get into support as the starting point or the foot in the door. It
mm.
is okay and great to make that your career. There are wonderful
Yeah,
people in there. Let me tell you,
yeah.
those conferences are great. You've got a room full of supporters. It's a wonderful place to be.
Well, I think it's
Um,
kind of like IT, right? Because so many IT people end up. IT is such an outdated term, but um, they start on the help desk. They're just fixing people's laptops and whatever, and then they go off into the different things they want to
yeah,
do. So yeah, I can see that as a career start for a lot of people.
yeah.
I think one
Well,
thing, one question I really want to come back to is like, why does so much support content suck? Because I've had to look at quite a few examples for what we've been doing and just in general, just using products. Why does it suck? And I obviously there are organizational and structural issues, most of which we've talked about. But and I think people understand why it sucks. You go there and the articles aren't in predictable formats, so you're having to read every single thing rather than skim to understand if you're going to miss something. Uh, Maybe they even refer to features in a different way than the product does, right? So it's inconsistent terminology. Maybe the articles themselves are too long, they're not specific enough. Like you should be able to find answers very quickly to the problem that you have. In your experience, what makes so much of this support content subpar? And what really stands out to you as like some of the most common mistakes people are making?
well, in terms of what makes it subpar, I know I hear this conversation happening a lot in content design, content strategy, any kind of content circle where there is this thing that we all struggle with where anyone has access to a Word document and anyone can write, right? So
Yep.
I think that's where a lot of it comes from, right? We've already established like support itself is often considered an afterthought. I know that content feels that a lot too sometimes, where there's more emphasis placed on the design pieces of it, that kind of thing. Yeah, so there's often more emphasis placed on the design or other pieces of the business that are more easily seen as profit drivers. And anyone, or no, there's more emphasis placed on the people where like they have a more obvious specific skill set that's required, and people see writing as something that we all do in school, so everyone can do it. As content designers, as strategists, whatever that is, we all know that that is not true.
Mm,
That
mm,
content is a practice and it is a skill set. And there are certain people who are going to be better at it than others at your organization. Ideally, people who work with and have learned and trained in the content profession, right?
mm.
That goes with any practice. Just because I can edit a photo on my phone or on like that doesn't mean I'm using Photoshop. I'm not a professional. Like it all goes back to a lot of that.
Yeah.
um, when it comes to why it's so inconsistent, the issues that I see, I think while there's like a trickle down effect happening here, right? Like we see it in content practices where at a management leadership level, your leaders are over here making decisions between like where do they want to allocate budgets, who do they want to work on what. Well, everyone has a Google Doc, a Word doc, anyone can write, but we need people to do XYZ. So there's obviously that that leadership level where people are overlooking the value and the necessity of content professionals that we see in any content practice. That just, it happens. When it comes to support content itself, I, what is the saying where it's like, never attribute to malice what can be attributed to like ill intent, like just not, I don't want to say stupidity because that's not what is
Yeah.
happening. It's just, yeah,
Uh,
it's a razor.
incompetence.
Yeah, incompetent. So I'm not saying people are incompetent, but the fact is, like, oftentimes the people tasked with working with support content are given little to no guidance. They're doing their best, but they don't really know what they're doing. So they think, I said earlier, like, just because I absorb information one way doesn't mean that everyone absorbs it that way. They don't necessarily understand what is going to make that content work for the widest number of your users. And that we've addressed it a few times, but the touchy thing about what is technical writing versus support content, ultimately to me, technical writing is you're writing content for people who already know what they're doing, practitioners of a skill. Where support content aims to support the widest number of users possible with that piece of content. The ways that we do that are, making it skimmable. That's a huge one. The other thing we're considering too is support content. Tech writing thinks about it a little bit, but I think especially support content, as we're seeing the rise of chatbots and things, we have to write in ways that work for machines. So again, that skimmability is really important. The structure of the content is really important, not just writing out everything that you want your users to know in one big paragraph or two and calling it a day. The big thing too is like the big thing as well, thinking about the cognitive burden of your users. So I see a lot of help centers. I mean, and this is one where it's my opinion, my experience. I have anecdotal evidence and conversations that confirm my beliefs on a lot of this because there just hasn't been a lot of research into support content explicitly. I promise you I've looked for it. Maybe that's something we can work on later. But the concept of cognitive burden and the way that a lot of help centers will break up the steps to a process with massive screenshots or, Giphies are even better. Video is better. Sometimes you'll only see video, but the fact is, like, I know if I'm quickly trying to figure out the steps in a process, basically, I like to think of your users that are consuming support content on a spectrum. So on one side, we have basically the people that technical content documentation is written for. So our friends that are developers, product managers, people who really understand, and this is talking about support content with technical products, but people who really understand how products work. And then on the other side of that spectrum, you have, I often think of my grandmother or my English teacher from middle school, who's not necessarily old, but also not super invested in wanting to know and understand how all technical products work. They don't need to. And then there's people, I would consider myself somewhere kind of on the middle, more on the technical side of that spectrum. So you have people all along it. So you're trying to think of the things and like, what's the cognitive burden there? Well, with video, personally, as someone who I can probably figure out most of the steps to the process, but I need help with like one particular thing, a video is not going to help me with that. I don't want to watch an entire 4-minute video when I can skim 3 or 4 steps in 30 seconds or less, right? Like we skim, we know that people skim. There's been lots of research done on that. So thinking about making those articles more skimmable, but also having the content there. And when I talk about, I mentioned, sorry, coming back, talking about the cognitive burden piece of that too, like when those steps to a process are broken up by massive screenshots and you're scrolling, on a computer, maybe that's not as difficult to absorb. But when I'm on my phone and I'm scrolling through a long article and there's a massive screenshot that takes up the entire screen in between each step, it gets
Super
pretty
annoying.
disorienting pretty quickly, especially if I'm going from the Help Center article to whatever I'm doing on my phone. Because let's be honest, most of us are doing things on our phones now. The app that I'm trying to troubleshoot is on my phone, and I'm looking at an article. Depending on the integrations that you have going with your help center, I'm looking at an article that's either integrated within that app and I'm going back and forth, or maybe I'm going from like a browser tab back to it. I want to be able to easily figure out where I was. And when I have to scroll through, the page might refresh, whatever that is. So talking about like really short, concise articles and big strategy of interlinking your content and making sure that the article on a particular page is physically short because we're thinking about mobile devices, but also very direct on the topic because you want to give people a holistic experience of support, right? So like my I might know how I got to this, like, oh gosh, what is my example that I always use? I always think about like article types in terms of login and getting started. So like
Mm-hmm.
if you're first of all, if your organization does not have a get started article, get started guide, you need that. Just please have that. I think everyone could use that. It's such a good experience for new users to have somewhere to go. I hate going to a help center. I don't know where to start because I don't know enough about the product to know
Yeah.
where to get started. So that's just the
And
first.
often it's
Yeah.
not like
Yeah.
enough to have like an onboarding process, right? You need
Right.
that longer piece of
Right.
content.
And even if that get started article is just the onboarding process written into an article, that's fine. Work with your
Yeah.
support team making something like that happen, but you want to have some kind of home base for that because maybe I flipped through the onboarding steps and I got done what I needed to. And then 2 weeks later, I'm doing a new task and
Mm.
I haven't interacted with the app that much yet. So I'm still kind of, you know, the conversation of like, does layout matter? Yeah, because I don't fully understand the vocabulary of this product yet. And so
Yeah,
when
you're
the
building the mental model and so on.
right,
You
right.
touched
So in the help
briefly
center,
on. Oh, sorry, go on. No, finish up.
yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, so when the help center is well organized for those things and thought and thinking about new users, but also you have that get started guide where I have a really easy place to go and I can
Mm.
scroll through and be like, okay, I know I've done steps 1 through 5, but what are the next things? And so we're thinking about article breaking up, like you don't want to have a massive article. That's still true. If there's 8 core things that you want your users to do when they're getting started with your product, maybe they're not doing them right away, but it's still kind of a new user first few months kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, you want to list out all those things and then you link to more specific articles to give them more context. But for someone like me or your more technical people who can figure out how to use the product, we just kind of need some direction on where to go. That get started guide is everything.
Yeah.
It's so
Absolutely.
helpful to just have that reference point of steps.
Yeah.
And then
And
if I need more,
I think it goes against like the idea that there's this idea I think in content design. Well, you put everything in the user interface, and then you won't need the help and support content, which I just think is just not true. But you touched on one thing there that I want to end on actually, which is this idea of chatbots and AI. So I had an experience just today before this recording actually, where so I bought this new camera, and so instead of doing my laptop camera, I've now got this fancy, Sony camera.
I noticed that.
They're not paying me, by the way. I don't know why I said Sony, but they're not paying me at all. But I needed to set the film setting from 720 to 4K. So I googled, how to do that. Everything I got was hour-long videos. How to set up your camera, how to set up this, how to set up that. I was begging for an article that was literally just like how to switch on 4K for this camera. And it's relevant that you brought up the idea of chatbots and AI because as more companies, as AI is sort of taking over everything, more companies are now like, oh, one of the easiest things we can do is create a support bot that's trained on all of our support content. But of course, you need the written content to exist in the first place in order for that to become an asset. So it's interesting. A couple of episodes ago, Scott Kuby was talking about how the most important thing right now is structured content. You really need to understand structured content. And you've mentioned that today as well. And I think it's
Yeah.
become pretty clear that for companies wanting to introduce some sort of AI experience, LLM experience, support is a natural place to go, but only if it's structured well, the articles are similar, there's predictable formats and so on. So
Mhm.
to bring that back to the answer of like how can you convince companies to see it as an asset, I mean that's one reason right there.
One thing to consider with all that, I kind of mentioned earlier, right? Like the importance of short, concise articles. When something else we talked about earlier too is that not every team working with support content has access to like what many people would consider like proper structured content. That's talking about like
Mhm.
DITA practices, the DITA practices, things like that. Like those are very important. Not all of us have access to that. So something, if you're interested in all that, by the way, I've learned a lot from the Content Wrangler with Scott Abel. And I had joined one of his webinars once that was all about like structured content, whatever. And I'd asked that question because I'm like, I don't have access to a headless CCMS, whatever it is, like whatever I need to create that properly structured content. And so what can we do? And the speaker, I cannot remember which talk it was, but the speaker had a great response. They were like, first of all, that might not be the tooling that you need, but also
Mhm.
you can still work towards structured content without actually getting into the back end of the content and the source code, whatever you need to do. So, um, yeah, you can get into creating that structured content without actually having to dive into the source code on the back end. So you do that with, we think broadly, you better believe that we have an entire unit about structure because of this. So, I mean, it's true. And it took me a long time of like wrapping my head. And I made this kind of, I like thinking of it as like this funnel kind of structure. It's your layout, but like your topics, whatever, how you group the content together in the topics. That's kind of like the
Information
broadest.
architecture.
Right. You're thinking about
Yep.
those exactly information architecture, kind of narrowing it down and thinking about the purpose of the content. So that can get into article types or things as granular as what you just said. I want to set up 4K specifically. Now, that's a really specific thing within this camera. There's probably lots of other ways, and maybe their support content team could find a way to work around it. But like, if you ask me, there should be an article of, set up 4K on whatever that is. And then you have complementary things, they live near each other. But when it's separated like that, basically as you're doing all these things, you're starting to kind of create the metadata. So these machine that the way that the machines are learning from your content is they look at that broad layout. They're informed by, okay, what's the broadest category of this? And now what is the next closest thing? Then they're looking at article titles and I think technically they weigh the titles more and then they consider that other layout stuff. Either way, it's all contributing to the metadata that these machines are learning from. From there, I like to think of structure literally as your style guidelines, specifically a shared vocabulary, because humans are confused when you're using multiple different terms to say the same things. Machines are even more confused by that. That is going to drastically increase the chances of hallucinations if you're not consistent with your word choices. So little granular things like that. But also within those style guidelines, within your articles, you're going to use headers in a really specific way. And in a consistent way, ideally, and finding ways to create snippets for these bots to pull from. All of those strategies are how you can kind of influence. And I look at it as a little funnel, and the base of that funnel is my little metadata thing. I should publish that at some point. But basically, like when you're in that healthy ecosystem, you can think about structuring your content that way and creating as much metadata as you can without actually having to touch the source code. Like there are ways to do it, and maybe it's not as ideal as creating actual structured content, but you're working toward it, and it's certainly going to make a transition easier later if you have well organized structured content going into, because there's lots of organizations that are eventually they find themselves in the place where, okay, we're moving from a more simplified help center tool like the Zendesk guide, and now we actually want to adopt one of these component CMS systems. And that was redundant. One of these component CMSs platforms. Love an
But I
acronym.
think like what your
Yeah,
point's
near the
really good
point.
though,
Yeah.
because like the idea, even if you don't have access to like structured content, capital S, capital C
Mhm.
tools, there's still
Yeah.
all this structure that you can build in just in the formatting and the style and the organization of it, which is important for people to understand. I think for AI especially, for people looking to get into that type of tooling, organizing content in that way is a really great way in. Um, we've sort of reached the end of our time, which has just flown by. We've covered like so much, and I'm really excited for people to learn more about this practice. Um, if you would like one people to sort of walk away understanding one thing about how to improve their support experiences, what would it be?
Can I say three things?
Okay,
Because
you can
it's
say
like
three things. I'll give you three
they're
things. Yeah.
concise. They're quick.
Okay.
They're not my usual tangents. This was the top and the end of a talk that I did for the support driven community. Like, if nothing else, because all of this really is about approaching it with intention. And the way that you can do that is, first of all, always focus on your users. What are their needs? What can you do to help them? Put yourself in their shoes if you need to. That's the first most important thing. The second most important thing is to be predictable, which I know is difficult at all of these big fancy organizations that want to innovate these days, but your support content lays a foundation for being able to innovate. It should not be exciting in itself. It should be very predictable, for machines, for people, for whatever future initiatives that you might bring. And then the last thing is to do the thing. Don't overthink it, which, I mean, I am a queen of overthinking. I would know. Don't sit back and overthink it. The more research that I've done, the more that I've seen the importance of kind of those iterative agile processes, right? Just like keep working towards something better. Do what you can little by little to make that content better. Oftentimes it's funny because I'm like, my little funnel starts at the top, but really sometimes you have to start small. Start with a style guide. Start with creating that shared vocabulary and start putting that into any articles that you touch moving forward. And over time, that adds up. But don't sit on trying to create the perfect support content strategy and you wait and hold on to it to release it. Do what you can. You can create things and make them better over time, because the fact is, if your organization is currently in business, your users are probably currently needing some form of content. So don't sit on it. Do something. Find the little things that you can do that are within your control and make it happen. That's the best thing that you can do for your users, which goes back to that first of the three things. So
Excellent. Man,
I'm
this has been
so
fantastic. Where can people find you online if they want to connect with you or read more of your work or just learn about you in general?
Oh boy. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm the only one of me. So there's that. If you just search me wherever. I'm pretty active in the support driven Slack community. So for any support people out there, I'm a big fan of those guys. And then I do have my website. I'm trying to build up some content on there. I just wrote, not just, but September published a very long thing about diataxis, which I know Patrick is very tired of hearing about.
That's not true.
And you can
That's
find that. I don't know. You can find that on my website, contentbymfe.com, which I think is linked on my LinkedIn. So
well, we'll link all of this in the show notes so people will be able to find you. Mary, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining. And everyone who's interested, go and check out the support course if you're interested in that sort of thing. I can 100% vouch for the fact that it is a fantastic asset. And man, you should be very proud of the fact that it's done and published and all of the rave reviews that it has received.
It's important. We don't have anything like it. So I'm really excited for someone, hopefully like myself, to have a resource like this. That's truly what went into it, is what would I have wanted and needed. So
that's the best way to do it. Awesome. Thanks, Mary.